Okay, so now let's look at what the basic functions of your skeletal system are. There's 5, 6 different different functions, and then you can break them down into subcategories on this. The different functions we'll look at will be that the skeletal system provides a support function. So let's go over here, provides support. And with support, it provides a framework for the body, okay? It allows for your arms and legs. It just gives you your general design of the body, and then that design allows it to provide other functions, okay? You have support, you have protection. Okay, protection associated with the skeletal system is that the bone provides protection, or it protects the delicate soft tissues or organs that lie underneath it, and it protects it from injury or trauma. So your skull is protecting your brain from any injury or trauma. Your rib cage is protecting your heart and lungs. The pelvis is protecting reproductive organs. It's protecting some of your digestive organs, some of the intestines. So those are your primary components for the protective side of this. Another function is going to be movement. Movement is accomplished by muscle contraction, and in our previous, I believe it was just the previous video that we just did, we noticed that muscles attach to bones via tendons, okay? So when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which then pulls on the bone. Now we have a system of levers in your skeletal system. Bones that come together and it forms a joint, which then forms a lever. So a tendon is crossing that joint, will pull on that joint or pull on that bone, and it allows for movements. Okay, so this is going to be looking at the movement component of this one. Okay, so bones are attached to the muscles via the tendons. The other one is going to be hemopoiesis. So, hemopoiesis. That's defined as the process of blood formation. Now, when we get into the blood component, which will be right after midterm, if I'm not mistaken, we will be looking into this much more detailed on this. But hemopoiesis is just the process of blood formation. Now, this is going to be red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. This is just a generic term for this one. Now, hemopoiesis occurs in red bone marrow, okay? And depending on your age, will determine where that red bone marrow is. As a child, most of your bones will contain red bone marrow, which then is associated with blood production. As you grow up and become an adult, the location of red bone marrow begins to limit itself to mostly your axial skeleton, okay? And more specifically, the flat bones of your axial skeletal system, okay? So what we're looking at on here, let me just see if I've got my little notation that I want to make sure I cover. Okay, so your flat bones that deal with hemopoiesis in the adult, like I says, are basically the flat bones of your axial skeleton, which is going to include hip bones, which is going to be like the pelvis. It's going to be the sternum. They are going to be ribs and skull. They are going to be located in your vertebra, that's your backbone, your scapula, your shoulder blade, and you will also find red bone marrow in the spongy tissue, the spongy bone of the proximal end, or the proximal epiphysis. That's going to be another word that you will need to know. The proximal end of your femur and your humerus. So that's where red bone marrow is going to be located in an adult. Okay, so that's going to be hemopoiesis. The another component is going to be storage of minerals and energy reserves. So the storage of minerals, what we're looking at are your two primary ones associated with your skeletal system is going to be calcium and phosphate. Okay, so calcium is necessary for muscle contraction. It's going to be necessary for blood clotting. It's necessary for release of neurotransmitters from a nerve cell. Once we get into that system, the nervous system, we'll go into a little bit more detail on that one. Phosphates necessary for ATP production. So if you recall what ATP stands for, adenosine triphosphate. Well, the phosphate comes from this component of this. Okay, it's necessary for the production of phospholipids, which is a component of your plasma membrane, the cell membrane. So those are necessary for this one. For the energy reserves are basically stored fats or lipids, and this is in yellow marrow. So it's really easy to determine the difference between red blood cells and red bone marrow and yellow marrow. So hemopoiesis is going to be in red bone marrow. Okay, so you're looking at red blood cells. That's a B in there, actually. That's a B. And you're looking at platelets. Okay. Also a little bit of the white blood cells, depending on where you're wanting. Okay, we'll get into much more detail on this in about 8 weeks or so. Yellow marrow is going to be for fat storage or energy reserves. Okay. Now, in many cases, if there is a stressor on your body that requires more red blood cells to be produced, such as living at a higher altitude, some of the yellow marrow will convert over to red marrow, but then it will convert back. Okay, but we'll get into that more detail on this one. So your primary functions of this one is going to be support, protection, movement, hemopoiesis, and then the storage of minerals, calcium and phosphate, and energy reserves. And the energy is in the form of lipids or fat, and that's in the yellow bone marrow on this one. Now for the storage of the minerals, what we're looking at on those two on here, if you need additional calcium or phosphates in your blood, what happens, how it takes it from the bone, is it breaks down the bone. So your bone's being torn down a little bit by specialized cells, which then releases the calcium and phosphate into your bloodstream, which then makes it available for the rest of the body. So that's those are the basic functions of the skeletal system. Next up is, I'm not sure. Next up, we'll find out in a second.